bread heels soaked in bacon drippings, potato peel soup stretched with one bone, flour and water fried in a dry skillet. Your grandparents had a word for all of it. Tuesday. The recipes that kept them alive never made it into any cookbook. Here are 60 Depression-era recipes your grandparents actually ate to stay alive. A book by Sarah McClanahan found out that in white, middle-class married families, domestic violence was another ugly and dark side effect of the recession, which had sunk its claws deep into families across the nation. There was a shocking and concerning rise of cases of physical abuse, almost always towards women or children, as financial strains meant very frustrated men coming back home. What would make matters even more volatile is the rise of substance abuse issues as a way of coping. And since the only substances easily available were dangerously cheap ones, the impact of it was even worse. The data that McClanahan used for her book was both from employed and unemployed fathers, though, which shows that it was not just the lack of a job that drove these habits. Either way, entire scores of grown men could not take losing their job well, despite how everyone else in the house was dealing with the same financial issues they were. But it seems like the government should have been offering stress management classes too. Delaware also had to make do with what scraps it could get. People from there were passing day by day on peas and soups, so the two would eventually cross over. It was natural for pea soup to become as common as it did in Delaware. It was a way to keep hydrated, get protein, and get some carbs too, depending on the kind of peas that were available. Making soups out of anything you could was kind of just the thing to do back then. It was a really common practice that a lot of Americans started adopting because of how convenient and easy to make they were. The supermarket culture of America was actually a result of the growth spurt in America's finances during the Roaring '20s. A lot of marts popped up and they became a much more common sight, and as a result, so did icebox cakes. These cakes were first shown to the public in World War I as a quick and easy way to whip up a cake minus all the tedious baking. Everybody loves cracking open the oven every now and then, but sometimes you just want your sweet tooth catered to without all the grunt work. Icebox cakes were the way to go for situations like that. All you needed were crackers and some whipping cream. Many marts sold ready-to-serve packaged versions too, so you can imagine how this got around as much as it did. When Depression-era homemakers faced piles of leftover mashed potatoes, tossing them out wasn't even on the menu. Instead, they turned to the wonderfully versatile dish known as mashed potato pancakes. With affordability and accessibility in mind, this clever recipe utilized basic kitchen ingredients: leftover potatoes, flour, egg, and perhaps a sprinkle of onion or herbs if they were lucky. By frying these ingredients into golden brown pancakes, cooks skillfully transformed last night's side dish into today's main attraction, proving their ingenuity in reducing waste and maximizing resources. Beyond economy, potato pancakes became a Depression-era favorite for their satisfying crispness, turning humble leftovers into something you'd genuinely anticipate. Creativity born from necessity drove home cooks to experiment by folding in diced onions, stray ham bits, or even a dash of paprika, crafting variations that rivaled their breakfast cousins at fancy hotels. Amusingly, families soon realized these pancakes were so deliciously economical that purposely making extra mashed potatoes became standard practice. Fried treats weren't exactly commonplace during the Great Depression, but creative home cooks found clever ways to stretch pantry staples into delicious finger foods worth sharing. Sauerkraut balls emerged from immigrant communities, transforming humble sauerkraut, preserved, vitamin-rich, and affordable, into crispy, golden appetizers that vanished quickly at potlucks. Made from drained sauerkraut mixed generously with breadcrumbs, sometimes bound with mashed potatoes when eggs were scarce, these tangy bites showcased true culinary ingenuity. With meat being rare and expensive, cooks added flavor by sautéing onions or garlic, cleverly creating an irresistible aroma without extra cost. Sauerkraut itself, fermented cabbage rich in vitamin C, was both economical and beneficial, often a life-saving source of nutrients in winter months. Frying these tangy morsels in inexpensive rendered fats like lard or bacon grease created a crunchy exterior irresistible enough to tempt even skeptical eaters. Interestingly, though sauerkraut balls originated from Central European cooking traditions, Their Depression-era popularity quickly spread beyond cultural boundaries, proving that tasty comfort foods transcend economic conditions. Prune cake brought dense, moist sweetness to Christmas tables when other fruits were too expensive. Dried prunes were affordable, shelf-stable, and available year-round at general stores, making them reliable for families who could not afford fresh fruit or canned goods. The batter was enriched with stewed prunes chopped and folded throughout, along with spices like cinnamon, allspice, and nutmeg that transformed simple ingredients into something festive. Baked in cast-iron pans, the cake emerged dark, fragrant, and moist in ways other Depression-era cakes rarely achieved. The prunes kept it from drying out, allowing it to be made ahead for Christmas Day. Some families added powdered sugar dustings while others served slices plain, letting fruit and spices speak for themselves. Prune cake was practical rather than glamorous, but it delivered real satisfaction to families who had learned that survival and celebration could coexist, each slice proving modest ingredients could still create holiday memories. Molasses snow biscuits were the winter morning treat families depended on when cold wind rattled the windows and sugar was too expensive to use freely. Molasses poured slow like winter honey, thick and dark, stretching sweet flavor through dough that otherwise would have tasted plain. Grandma mixed flour, baking powder, lard, and just enough molasses to tint the dough the color of early morning shadows. She shaped them quickly, hands practiced, and placed them close together so they rose against one another like a small family huddled for warmth. When they baked, the kitchen filled with the deep scent of molasses that made the whole house feel less cold. These biscuits were soft inside, with a slight crust outside, the perfect thing to tear open and eat with butter if you had it or plain if you did not. They were born from practicality but tasted like comfort, proof that even the simplest ingredients could become something worth remembering. On winter mornings when the world outside felt frozen, these biscuits made the first hour of the day feel hopeful. They were not fancy, but they were dependable, and that meant everything. Molasses snow biscuits were the kind of food that stayed in families even when circumstances changed, whispered from one kitchen to another, because no cookbook ever bothered to capture their worth. Salt pork steaming for flavor was one of those tricks passed down without ever hitting paper. When beans were on the menu, which was often, a small piece of salt pork was tied in cloth or hung over the pot while everything simmered. The pork never touched the beans. It just hovered, steaming, sweating, lending its salty, smoky essence to the bubbling pot below. It was a way to stretch flavor without using up meat. The same chunk might be reused for multiple batches, trimmed and hung again until it was dry and lean. Beans took on the taste of meat without costing you the real thing. It was economical, practical, and deeply clever. In a time when every ounce of protein had to count, that little piece of pork did heavy lifting. And the resulting beans, soft, savory, and touched with richness, fed families for pennies. During the Dust Bowl, one thing that was actually more common than you may ever think was lasagna with homemade noodles. Though of course, as with everything here, there is a catch. It's not the lasagna you're thinking of or the one Garfield's famous for falling in love with. Not anywhere close, no. It was instead vegetable lasagna, and the noodles were really DIY serviceable versions that just barely met the mark. It was such a disaster in Texas and Oklahoma, Kansas that people there were lucky to have anything even remotely resembling noodles still. After all, most of the stuff you'd use for homemade noodles was going through crop failure or food shortages. People really began to get into homemade noodles after they had a bit more experience growing food on their own, and when they could more reliably get potatoes out of their victory gardens. As far as the lasagna went, cabbages, spinach, carrots, kale, onions, broccoli, anything people had that was green would go in it. This was also a dish that inspired people to really take advantage of canned food too, and they definitely did by substituting a lot of root vegetables with canned goods. Don't get the wrong idea though, these were really makeshift versions of both dishes. It was nowhere near an actual vegetable lasagna either. It was more fitting to call it a lot of layered vegetables, really. In a time when heating was expensive and resources were scarce, families during the Great Depression turned to a natural, free source of warmth: the sun. Capitalizing on every sunny moment, they would gather near windows to soak up the heat from the daylight. This wasn't just about enjoying a bit of sunshine, but also a strategy to stay warm and conserve fuel. By sitting close to the glass, people maximized the heat trapped inside, making the most of the sun's natural energy. The role of nature was clear. The sun, when it shone, became a vital part of home heating. On clear days, people would move furniture to optimize sunlight exposure, often taking turns to bask in the warmth. With homes built with larger windows in mind, especially in rural areas, this practice became a clever adaptation of the environment. This practice also fostered family togetherness. On sunny days, households would find themselves gathering in the same room, warming their bodies and spirits. Today, we can take a page from this frugality. Natural heat, though often overlooked in modern times, is still a powerful resource, reminding us that sometimes a little sunlight can go a long way, both in saving money and lifting spirits. Cabbage coleslaw proved that absolutely nothing went to waste in the Depression era. While most people today throw away the tough core of a cabbage, thrifty families of the 1930s shaved it finely to make a crunchy salad. With vinegar, a little sugar, and maybe a pinch of salt, it transformed into something tangy and surprisingly refreshing. Carrots or onions, if available, might be added for color and flavor, but often it was just the cabbage core itself. It became a side dish for meals that otherwise would have been too plain or heavy, adding brightness without any real cost. This slaw was a simple reminder that waste was not an option, and even what many considered garbage could become a dish worth serving. Families learned to enjoy the sharp taste and crunchy bite, and for some, it even became a regular part of the dinner table. Now, the choke cherry, on the other hand, was a berry that was a bitter pill to swallow, but one that you most definitely would swallow. Not only because most days it was one of the only fruits around, but also because you'd find it just about everywhere. From the Rocky Mountain ranges to the Great Plains and everything in between, chokecherry was an established local resident of almost every square foot of American land. These small, deep red berries grew in these clusters on some really rough shrubs and small trees, the kind of thing that evolved to adapt to the harsh conditions it was always finding. You know what I mean? It's not something that people would struggle to forage, but it is something that people have a lot of issues eating. See, the reason they began to be called chokecherries is because of how much people would gag when eating one. They were just that bitter, and no amount of time being slow cooked in a pot waiting for the boiling to happen would help that. Chokecherries did have a lot of medicinal uses, though, and that's also why they were sometimes sold. People wanted the bark of chokecherry trees for teas that could help with cough remedies. The berries themselves helped reduce digestion issues by a lot, and in general, they were excellent for your gut health. While you might hear a lot about how during the economic spiral following the market crash it was very hard to feed families, you often do not hear about the effect that had on marriage and birth rates. You have to look at it from their angle to really get why people became so averse to the thought of marriage. Because firstly, that was a time where only the necessities needed to survive mattered. Most people were better off fending for themselves, and a marriage, and possibly starting a family, was not only more mouths to feed, but a massive financial responsibility. People simply could not afford to get married, and those who did had very simple and plain ceremonies. Even rarer still was the couple that decided to have kids. On the other hand, the couples that were around before the recession who had gotten sucked into it actively did everything they could to avoid having a child or any more children. The same thing happened in the 2008 recession too, but it was much more drastic in the 30s. They knew that if they were to start families and get married, none of that would end well. It is pretty far from anyone's idea of a white picket fence and a lush green yard. One of the things you'll often hear your grandparents repeating like a broken record or a parrot is the importance of corn in your diet and how you really need to eat your greens and your corn. Well, it's not for nothing. Cut them some slack and just lend an ear the next time you hear it, because in Arkansas, and in a majority of other states too, fried cornbread and greens were the daily lunch and breakfast of many families. Cornbread in general was ridiculously cheap and easy to get, and it was common for people to barter with it or for it too, so it definitely got a lot of mileage in Arkansas, thanks to them always having a knack for growing corn. Next on this list, we're going to take a long and hard look at depression cake. I know those are two things you never associate with each other, but this isn't half as depressing as its name makes it out to be. Depression cake, also sometimes known as war cake, was an eggless and dairy-free variant of the regular chocolate cake that people had become so fond of throughout their many birthdays. It was first popularized during the Depression as a way to deal with the low stocks of egg, flour, milk, butter, and eggs. All the basic ingredients you would need that make up a cake were now things that people were fighting each other over, or stores were just never keeping due to them being expensive in bulk. It meant that for a long time, sweet treats and desserts were off the menu for a lot of people. Birthdays were spent without cakes, and important celebrations wouldn't have anything sweet to, well, celebrate with. That's why this recipe was so dear to people at the time and why it continues to be a reminder of how innovative people can be under stress. During the Depression, it was extremely common for people to ration their eggs and butter if they had any. Spending it all on a cake may as well have amounted to blasphemy. Okay, this one is a bit of a curveball. Cold milk soup? But hey, desperate times call for desperate measures. Cold milk soup was a Depression-era staple, and it's exactly what it sounds like. This dish has Amish origins and was one of the most popular meals back in the day. It was also pretty simple to whip up. Take some milk, mix in sliced bananas, a bit of sugar, and sometimes even bread or other fruits. And there you have it, cold milk soup. It might not sound like much, but for many families, this was a quick and easy way to get some calories and nutrients, especially when fresh ingredients were hard to come by. The bananas added some natural sweetness, while the milk provided protein and fat. It was a simple, no-cook meal that could be thrown together in minutes and was perfect for those hot summer days when turning on the stove was the last thing you wanted to do. During an era when store-bought meals were rare luxuries and wasting food was unthinkable, resourceful cooks relied heavily on their gardens, pantries, and plenty of improvisation. It was precisely under these circumstances that biscuits topped with tomato gravy became a beloved staple in Depression-era households. The dish was ingenious, showcasing creativity born from necessity. Leftover tomatoes, often bruised or overripe, simmered down slowly into a savory, thickened gravy, perfectly illustrating how reducing waste and maximizing resources became a domestic art form. Affordability and accessibility played pivotal roles too, as biscuits required only a handful of pantry ingredients like flour, shortening, and milk. Interestingly, tomato gravy was especially popular in southern regions, not only because tomatoes thrived there, but also because folks humorously declared, "When meat's missing from your gravy, tomatoes step right in." In fact, many Depression-era families fondly recall tomato gravy as their saving grace, turning otherwise plain, dry biscuits into satisfying meals without breaking their limited budgets. When meats and finer vegetables vanished from many kitchen tables during the Depression, resourceful cooks reached for something far humbler, the trusty turnip. Often overlooked today, turnips became an affordable culinary hero back then, especially in dishes like creamed turnips on biscuits, a comfort food innovation born from sheer necessity. Turnips were sliced, simmered until tender, and gently folded into a creamy sauce, a clever trick to stretch a few spoonfuls of milk or butter across multiple servings. If dairy was scarce, cooks ingeniously substituted bacon grease or broth, giving this humble root vegetable a savory boost without breaking the bank. Spooned generously over biscuits, often homemade from inexpensive flour and baking soda, this dish was a hearty solution when pantries looked depressingly bare. Surprisingly, turnips weren't merely filler food. They offered crucial vitamins like C and fiber, essential nutrients when fresh produce options were limited. Turnips also stored remarkably well, becoming a pantry staple in homes nationwide, meaning even families without gardens had dependable access to fresh vegetables throughout winter. Bread pudding transformed stale loaves into Christmas dessert, rescuing what would otherwise become waste and turning it into celebration. Every crust, every heel, every slice gone too hard to eat was saved throughout December until Christmas Eve arrived. The dried bread was torn into chunks, soaked in whatever milk the family could afford, then mixed with eggs, sugar, and precious spices like cinnamon and nutmeg. Baked until golden in cast-iron pans handed down through generations, the pudding emerged transformed from kitchen scraps into something resembling abundance. Families drizzled molasses or made simple sauces from butter and sugar to top their portions. The texture was both tender and substantial, the sweetness balanced by honest bread flavor. Bread pudding taught children that nothing should be thrown away, that creativity could rescue the humblest ingredients. This dessert carried Christmas forward when fancy cakes and store-bought sweets were impossible dreams for struggling households. Tomato soup with grilled cheese was the rainy day classic that never failed to make kids feel warm from the inside out. The moment a storm cloud rolled in, kids would start hoping their mothers would make this exact combo because nothing else matched the feeling of dipping a buttery sandwich into a bowl of steaming soup. The soup usually came straight from a can, cheap and dependable, mixed with water or milk to make it smoother. As it heated, the rich tomato smell filled the room, promising comfort before you even took the first bite. Meanwhile, the grilled cheese sizzled in a pan, the bread crisping in butter until it turned that perfect shade of golden brown. When the cheese melted completely, stretching in strings when you pulled the sandwich apart, you knew dinner was going to be perfect. Kids could barely wait for the soup to cool down before dipping the sandwich into it, soaking up all that warmth and flavor in one bite. It was simple, cheap, and so easy that mothers could make it even on their most exhausted days. But it never felt tired or ordinary. It felt like kindness in a bowl. It tasted like being taken care of. Kids begged for this meal because it felt like a warm hug, the food equivalent of being wrapped in a blanket while the world outside stayed cold and gray. It was childhood comfort at its absolute best. Potato peel broth was what you made when there were no bones to spare but still mouths to feed. People saved their potato peels, not the green or moldy ones, but the clean, starchy strips from good spuds, and tossed them into a pot with water, a pinch of salt, and maybe an onion if they had one. The mixture simmered until the water turned golden and fragrant, pulling out every last bit of starch and earthy flavor the peels had left. Sometimes they added celery tops or carrot ends, anything scrap-worthy. The result was a humble broth, rich in nutrients and surprisingly satisfying. It served as the base for thin soups or was sipped on its own when there was truly nothing else. It warmed the stomach and gave people a sense of having had a meal, even if it was just a bowl of flavored water. In kitchens where nothing could be wasted, even the trash held promise. Potato peel broth was never glamorous, but it was deeply practical. And for families scraping by, it was proof that a hot bowl of something could still be made from almost nothing at all. In working-class kitchens, the best meals weren't always planned. They were thrown together with whatever was available. A pound of ground beef, a can of tomatoes, some diced potatoes, and a handful of elbow macaroni could turn into a thick, hearty stew that stuck to your ribs and stretched across multiple meals. Some called it slumgullion, others just called it dinner. Dishes like this had no strict recipe, just a basic formula, cheap, filling, and endlessly adaptable. One night it might be heavy on potatoes, the next, macaroni took center stage. Some families added onions for flavor, while others bulked it up with beans or whatever vegetables were left in the fridge. The name slumgullion had been around since the 1800s, used by miners and sailors to describe a hodgepodge meal, proof that resourceful cooking had always been part of survival. Ground beef was one of the most affordable proteins in the 1960s, and canned tomatoes provided flavor without the cost of fresh produce. With a simple pot and a little seasoning, this one-dish meal fed entire families with ease. It was the kind of food that tasted even better the next day, reheated on the stove after a long shift or a day at school. Comfort food without the price tag. When the Great Depression gripped the country, homes were often drafty and poorly insulated, making it nearly impossible to keep the chill at bay. But families found a simple yet effective solution: draft stoppers. Old rags, torn-up clothes, and fabric scraps were stuffed into gaps beneath doors and around windows, blocking out the cold and keeping heat inside. It was a no-cost fix that required nothing more than some basic ingenuity and a willingness to make do with what was on hand. Nature's role in this process was subtle but significant. People living in rural areas often used materials like hay or straw, both readily available from farms to stuff into drafty cracks. But even in urban neighborhoods, a bit of creativity could turn any leftover fabric, be it an old jacket or an unused pillowcase, into a barrier against the cold. This practice also promoted a sense of shared responsibility within the household. Family members worked together to make their homes as warm as possible, often taking turns stuffing rags into troublesome spots. The lesson here is clear. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective, and a little frugality can go a long way in creating comfort. Peanut soup was a filling option that came straight out of the need for protein when meat was too expensive or unavailable. Ground peanuts simmered with water or milk created a creamy, nutty broth that was surprisingly hearty. Onions, celery, or a bit of leftover potato might be added to give it body, but the peanuts did most of the heavy lifting. The flavor was rich enough that it almost felt indulgent, even though it cost very little to prepare. Served with cornbread or biscuits if available, it could stretch into a complete meal for an entire family. Many households in the South relied on peanuts as a cheap crop, and this soup was a natural way to put them to use. For many children who grew up during the Depression, peanut soup became a nostalgic memory of warmth and survival, showing how simple ingredients could stand in for things they could not afford. Mulberries were considered a superfood for foragers. They were one of the most invaluable fruits throughout the entirety of the Depression. Mulberries, whether the ones that grew on native red mulberry trees or the white and black ones, which you may be more familiar with, were extremely common. Not just throughout one region or vast expanse of land, but throughout the nation. They were also rich in carbs, which made them one of the best sources of energy. It didn't stop there. They were packed with valuable vitamins, iron, manganese, and sugar, which helped keep people's health strong in tough times. It would especially help in keeping away the effects of starvation. It was also normal for people to have issues of inflammation thanks to their poor diets, rough environments, and labor-intensive jobs. Mulberries were a local remedy for them, whether they were eaten fresh or used in the form of preserves. It helped to keep a stash of mulberries for tough times. Most people just ate them as a snack throughout the day, but it was the fact that they were incredibly easy to grow and adaptable to most kinds of soil that made them such a strong pick for everyone's grandparents, not just ours. When families did have kids, though, they often came up with some pretty neat ways to keep themselves entertained, which was obviously to the delight of the parents. While today we cannot convince our kids to step away from the wonders of Roblox, kids back then would be making their own toys with whatever scraps of wood and cloth they could find. Not really proper as toys go, but it is all about the imagination and the time they spend with it. Plus, it was a common enough hobby among kids that neighborhood children would spend all day doing it with each other, and neighborhoods were already closer than ever before due to the benefits of being in a tight-knit community. Some kids would actually develop a real knack for it and sell the toys they would make for whatever cents they could get. Sometimes they would even make $1 out of it, so it is not like the parents ever really stopped them from pursuing their new toy-making interests. Some of those became precious mementos for them when they would later grow up and America would start recovering from the effects of the recession. Cornbread was also used as a substitute for the typical ingredients you would use for a pancake. And speaking of vegetables, one of the most reliable ones in the Depression for the country as a whole were potatoes. You can kind of see where I'm going with this, can't you? You've probably been around the block with potato pancakes more than a few times in your lifetime, but unless you're from Colorado, you wouldn't know about how the state has a natural tendency for potato farming. That's why any kind of dish that was made out of them was widely popular there, but especially pancakes, because it restored some sense of normalcy in a time that was drastically changing day by day. Potato pancakes, an incredibly famous go-to recipe for grandmas across the nation today. Do you know how and why they ended up nailing the recipe for a fine potato pancake so perfectly, though? Potatoes were one of the most easily available vegetables both when buying with cash or bartering, plus lots of people started growing their own produce. Potatoes were a crop they went for regularly, because the flour and butter needed for a real pancake was not an option for many people. So, potato pancakes became the common breakfast of the century for a good decade or two, and it honestly held its ground pretty well. Made out of grated potatoes and simple seasonings, this felt just as good as a legitimate pancake. Amid scarcity, Depression-era households leaned heavily on resourcefulness, turning even the simplest pantry staples into nutritious meals, leading directly to the rise in popularity of peanut butter bread. With just flour, peanut butter, sugar, and baking powder, home bakers concocted this hearty loaf, demonstrating remarkable creativity born from necessity. The affordability and accessibility of peanut butter played a significant role. By the 1930s, this creamy spread had transitioned from a health food for the wealthy into a cheap protein source for everyone. Interestingly, peanut butter bread required no yeast, a clever adaptation considering yeast was costly and sometimes unavailable, further reducing waste and maximizing resources. Food historians note that newspapers eagerly published this simple recipe, promoting it as the ultimate economical dish, sometimes even humorously suggesting peanut butter could single-handedly keep America strong. Many Depression survivors fondly remember slicing this loaf thinly, stretching its lifespan for days, or toasting stale slices for snacks, exemplifying an era when food waste was practically criminal. No Depression-era cook worth their salt would let good pickle brine go to waste, especially when flavoring was scarce and budgets tighter than the pickle jar lid. Thus, from humble kitchens emerged pickle soup, a tangy, resourceful dish blending leftover pickle juice, humble root vegetables like potatoes and carrots, and whatever pantry scraps happened to be available. Often thickened slightly with flour or potato starch, cooks could make this broth-based soup surprisingly filling without spending extra pennies. During an era when vinegar and spices were costly luxuries, leftover pickle juice became culinary gold, supplying robust flavor without extra expense. Clever substitutions like garden herbs or diced pickles replaced pricier seasonings, demonstrating Depression cooks' incredible ingenuity. Though today's diners might initially cringe at sipping pickle-flavored broth, the soup had a devoted following in communities with Eastern European heritage, where dill pickles reigned supreme and sour flavors were embraced wholeheartedly. Its tart profile even served as a comforting, affordable winter staple, beloved for its warmth and nutrient-rich ingredients like vitamin-filled veggies that prevented scurvy during harsh times. Stuffed cabbage rolls appeared on Christmas tables across immigrant communities, stretching small amounts of meat into dishes that fed entire families. The technique came from Eastern European traditions, adapted to Depression realities where ground meat was a luxury used sparingly. Cabbage leaves were blanched until pliable, then wrapped around filling of rice, onion, and whatever meat scraps the family could afford. Sometimes just tablespoons stretched through an entire batch. The rolls simmered for hours in tomato sauce, the long cooking tenderizing everything and melding flavors together. By Christmas dinner, each roll became a complete package of protein, grain, and vegetable. The aroma of simmering cabbage and tomatoes filled homes, announcing to neighbors that holiday meal was being prepared. Stuffed cabbage taught the art of stretching resources without sacrificing satisfaction, connecting families to heritage while solving the problem of feeding many mouths with little money. Corncob jelly was one of the most surprising Depression-era creations, turning what was usually discarded into something sweet and useful. After eating or cutting kernels from corn, families would boil the stripped cobs for a long time until the liquid turned golden. With sugar and sometimes pectin, this liquid became a jelly that spread easily on bread or biscuits. It had a mild corn flavor, slightly sweet, and it gave people a way to stretch ingredients without buying fruit for jams. Since sugar was often rationed or expensive, this jelly was seen as a clever way to create a sweet treat out of nothing more than scraps. Many families remembered it fondly, not only because it was thrifty, but because it represented resourcefulness at its finest. Children often spread it on cornbread or stale bread softened in milk, turning waste into dessert. It may seem odd today, but back then it was pure ingenuity. Mock whipped cream from evaporated milk was a tiny miracle that made dessert possible when dairy was scarce. You would chill a can of evaporated milk until it was icy cold, then beat it with sugar and a splash of vanilla until it fluffed up into soft peaks. It did not hold quite like real cream, but it got close enough for cake toppings, fruit bowls, or Jell-O salads. The texture was light but sturdy, and the taste had that rich, slightly caramelized edge evaporated milk is known for. It was not perfect, but it was magic in a pinch. Housewives swore by it for special occasions or Sunday suppers when a bit of sweetness was needed. Some even froze the whipped mixture for a pseudo ice cream. The trick was making the most of shelf-stable goods and transforming what seemed flat into something joyful. No one expected miracles during the Depression, but this came close. It made humble ingredients feel celebratory. And in homes where cream was just a dream, this trick kept dessert on the table and smiles in the room. In the biting cold of the Great Depression, staying warm outdoors was a necessity. Families with limited resources couldn't afford heavy winter coats, so they got creative. One surprisingly effective solution was newspaper. Slipping sheets of it inside coats, under shirts, or even between socks and shoes provided an extra layer of insulation that trapped body heat. It was practical, cheap, and easy to find, even if it made crinkling noises with every step. This ingenuity stemmed from the fact that newspapers were widely available, even during tough times. People often saved every issue, not just for reading, but for countless uses: insulation, wrapping food, or even patching drafty walls. Nature, too, played a role in this resourcefulness. By mimicking how animals insulate themselves, layering fur or feathers, families used newspaper to create their own version of thermal protection. Outdoor layering also, it highlighted the importance of family. Parents often made sure their kids were properly bundled up before braving the elements, turning layering into an act of care and protection. Carrot marmalade was a sweet spread that helped families feel like they had something luxurious for breakfast, even in the toughest years of the Depression. Sugar was precious, but when it could be managed, grated carrots simmered down with citrus peel made a bright orange jam that tasted far richer than its ingredients suggested. Citrus itself was not always available, so many recipes leaned heavily on the carrots, using peel or extract when possible. The finished marmalade was thick, fragrant, and easily spread across homemade bread or crackers, turning simple staples into something that felt festive. Children loved its sweetness, and parents appreciated how it stretched a handful of carrots into enough jam to last for several mornings. Many community cookbooks published carrot marmalade recipes, encouraging families to rely on what they could grow in gardens. It was a dish that turned scarcity into creativity, and for many households it became a small comfort that brightened otherwise plain and repetitive meals. Ground cherries were known as husk tomatoes. They were something that most people only knew about if they were around in the Depression. It's an unusual-looking fruit, golden, small, with an awfully fragile-looking husk. Ground cherries were something that could be best described as unique. They looked unique, they felt unique, and they tasted unique. The taste is something I'd say is similar to a blend of vanilla, citrus, and pineapple, as conflicting as those flavors might sound. Unlike a lot of fruits, though, ground cherries were something you could eat right from the get-go. Found one in the wild? All you had to do was pluck it out of the husk and eat it. It used to be an incredible foraged snack for children and other adults. They could be used to make jams, preserves, and even pies. After all, with something that tastes like this, you'd obviously want to see what you can make out of it, right? Depression-era cooks often made recipes like ground cherry pie, and the best part was this was a pie that took very little sugar because of how naturally sweet ground cherries were. Nutritionally, ground cherries were something that had a lot of beta-carotene. This is vomiting that does two things: support your eye health and boost your immune function. Why did you need good eye health? They didn't have screens to get addicted to, right? Well, you'd be surprised what living in polluted environments and working in them too can do to your eyes, and people who could see usually did a lot better than those who couldn't at finding resources in the wild. In the 1930s, schools were mostly an idea that people kept as a hope, not a realistic option for the future. Mostly because schools were packed to the brim and barely had the funding to run properly. Plus, getting kids to school was its own challenge, as most people could not afford gas or maintain vehicles. There was also an incredible uprising of racism. which meant that children of different races and colors had even fewer opportunities to chase a decent education. If a kid does not study, though, what do? It is a sad fact of American history, but child labor got pretty common in America. Even under child labor reform measures, kids could still work up to 8 hours, which is a full adult workday today. And many worked odd jobs like scavenging junk and selling it off, carrying newspapers, or doing petty chores that did not come into child labor laws. Of course, that was all on paper. Behind the scenes, children would get themselves into whatever kind of job they could find, at restaurants or businesses on their last leg for small cash, even if it was illegal for them to be hired. However, this was all they could do to keep the home going. People living in Arizona were pretty much eating very similarly to how people in Alabama were living. They had beans instead of peas and chili instead of molasses. But chili beans were something that people would eat even in regular times when the economy hadn't caved in on itself. So in that regard, they got off pretty lucky. I know that sounds like an exaggeration, but I'm really not kidding. It was a luxury to even have food, but to be able to enjoy it too made you one of the really lucky ones during the Depression. Chili beans, thanks to Mexican influences, let locals live another day. Hoover stew was one of those dishes that anyone could afford to make, so it is no wonder that the stew was a common item in the Great Depression. Hoover stew had two signature traits. It could feed the whole family, and you could have the dish without exceeding the monthly budget. As for the recipe, the dish involved using scraps and leftovers to increase savings and recycling in a time when households could not afford a lot. You did not need many spices, and you could easily use leftover meats. In an America where banks were going bankrupt and the job market was hopeless, the stew was a welcome addition. Obviously, it would be a popular choice among many households, as our older viewers might still remember. Fortunately, as economic stability came back, Hoover stew went away from tables in favor of more flavorful and varied stews. In times when families counted pennies and every slice of bread mattered, resourceful home cooks mastered the subtle art of turning stale loaves into irresistible treats. Take, for instance, the humble yet beloved cinnamon toast, a simple concoction of bread, butter, cinnamon, and sugar, elevated through creativity born from necessity. This Depression-era favorite thrived due to its affordability and accessibility, requiring only inexpensive staples most homes already had on hand. But here's an intriguing fact. Originally, cinnamon toast wasn't simply breakfast fare. It frequently appeared as a satisfying after-school snack or even a dessert, proving families' ingenuity in stretching resources. Frugal mothers transformed stale bread, usually destined for the birds, by crisping it in the oven, cleverly reducing waste and maximizing resources. An amusing anecdote from Depression cookbooks revealed that some creative cooks joked cinnamon and sugar were miracle workers, magically resurrecting even the toughest bread heels into sweet treats children clamored for. Though cinnamon toast might seem basic by today's gourmet standards, during the 1930s, it represented an affordable luxury, a delicious reprieve from endless soups and stews. Canned foods were lifesavers during the Depression, transforming pantries into treasure troves of culinary creativity. Enter Depression-era salmon pea wiggle, a whimsically named dish that brought some much-needed amusement and nutrition to potluck gatherings of the 1930s. At first glance, the unusual combination of canned salmon, peas, and white sauce spooned over crunchy crackers might raise eyebrows today. Yet back then, it represented clever homemaking at its best. Fresh fish was often prohibitively expensive, so budget-savvy cooks leaned on canned salmon, easily accessible and surprisingly nutritious, providing protein and omega-3s without emptying the purse. Similarly, fresh produce shortages led resourceful households to canned peas, giving the dish color and sweetness at minimal cost. The creamy white sauce was typically fashioned from pantry staples. Milk stretched thinly with flour or, in leaner times, water mixed with bacon grease as a tasty substitution. The quirky name wiggle likely came from the slightly jiggly texture of the white sauce, a playful touch, injecting a bit of fun into challenging circumstances. Molasses cookies were the sweet tradition that survived when sugar became too expensive for Christmas baking. Blackstrap molasses cost less than refined sugar and was available at every country store, giving these cookies their dark color and robust flavor. The dough was mixed by hand in wooden bowls, combining flour, lard or bacon drippings, eggs, and generous molasses until it formed a sticky, fragrant mass. Ginger, cinnamon, and cloves were added when available, transforming simple ingredients into something that tasted like the holidays. Cookies baked on greased pans until edges crisped and centers stayed soft, filling kitchens with spiced aroma children would remember for decades. Mothers made batches large enough to share with neighbors and to leave out for relatives. The dark sweetness hit the tongue differently than sugar, deeper, almost earthy, with mineral notes that tasted like comfort. Molasses cookies proved Christmas could still taste special, even when pennies stretched impossibly far. Mashed potatoes with hamburger gravy were the comforting, savory meal that made kids race to the table before the pot even left the stove. Mothers browned small amounts of ground meat, then stretched every drop of drippings into a rich gravy with flour, water, and simple seasoning. Poured over a mound of fluffy potatoes, the gravy turned an inexpensive side into a full meal. Kids loved how the potatoes soaked up the sauce, every bite warm and satisfying. It felt indulgent without being complicated or costly. Mothers appreciated how far a single pound of meat could go when used this way, feeding several people with ease. Kids begged for it because it tasted like the kind of comfort only home could offer. Mashed potatoes with hamburger gravy were proof that thrift could still taste like abundance. Turnip or rutabaga mashers stepped in when potatoes were gone or needed saving. You peeled and chopped the roots, boiled them until soft, and mashed them just like spuds. Bacon grease gave flavor. Vinegar added tang. Sometimes a bit of sugar balanced out the bitterness. These mashers were often served alongside boiled meats or eaten on their own with bread. They were hearty, filling, and could take on whatever flavors you had around. People raised on mashed potatoes might have complained, but over time, this dish earned its place at the table. Turnips and rutabagas were cheap, stored well through winter, and grew in poor soil, perfect for hard times. The mash was thinner than potatoes, but it had a distinct earthiness and bite. Some families swore by it, others tolerated it. Either way, it helped get dinner on the table without spending a dime. That kind of flexibility was the backbone of survival cooking. You used what you had and you learned to like it, or at least to make it work. Rabbit stew is a beloved traditional dish in various cultures, renowned for its hearty and comforting nature. This stew typically features tender pieces of rabbit slow-cooked with onions, garlic, and aromatic herbs like rosemary or thyme, which subtly enhance the mild flavor of the rabbit. Additional vegetables such as carrots, celery, and potatoes often join the mix, creating a robust, one-pot meal. The stewing liquid, usually wine or stock, enriches the dish, lending depth and complexity as it simmers. Rabbit meat, known for its leanness and delicacy, benefits greatly from the slow cooking process, becoming incredibly tender and infused with the rich flavors of the broth and vegetables. Rabbit stew is especially appreciated during the colder months or in rural settings where rabbit is a common game meat. When winters were unforgiving and fuel was a luxury, communities during the Great Depression found warmth in numbers, literally. Community bonfires became a resourceful way to conserve fuel while providing heat for multiple families at once. These gatherings became the heart of social bonding in hard times. Neighbors pooled whatever they could find, fallen branches, scraps of wood, or anything that could safely burn, to stoke the flames and keep the cold at bay. Nature itself lent a helping hand in this practice. Rural areas, in particular, relied on the bounty of nearby forests for firewood, while urban neighborhoods made use of discarded pallets or lumber from construction sites. Frugality was the driving force. Why light 10 individual fires when one could do the job for an entire street? Families saved precious resources and, in the process, fostered a sense of camaraderie that made the hardships a little easier to bear. Songs were sung, stories were shared, and for a few hours, the biting cold seemed a little less harsh. Today, this collective effort teaches us the power of community in times of need. And let's face it, sharing a fire is way more fun than huddling solo by a space heater. Stewed apples with bread cubes was a dessert that stretched every bit of fruit to its fullest during the Depression. A few apples, sometimes bruised or close to spoiling, were peeled and stewed with sugar or molasses if available. To make the dish go further, stale bread cubes were added to soak up the syrupy juices. The result was a warm, comforting pudding-like dish that could serve several people with only a handful of apples. Spices like cinnamon or nutmeg might be added when they could be spared, but even without them, the dish was sweet and filling. For many children, this was the closest thing to pie they would taste during those years. It turned waste into dessert and brought comfort at the end of long days. Even though it cost next to nothing, it felt like a treat worth remembering. Stewed apples with bread cubes showed how creativity kept hope alive. Osage orange, also known as a hedge apple or a horse apple, isn't really a fruit that's meant to be anywhere near your stomach. That doesn't mean it can't be useful, though, and that's exactly what happened during the Great Depression. It was a fruit that was native to Texas, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. People planted it outside of those areas too, but in these ones, the potential for foraging was much higher. The Osage orange trees on which these grew were actually a part of the natural layout of the land, acting as organic fencing. That is until barbed wire became more common, and development meant that a decent amount of them were cut down. These were green fruits filled with latex, and that made them a poor choice for eating, but sometimes you could give it to your cattle and pigs. Still, Osage orange was most known for its wood, which is extremely durable and rot-resistant. Osage orange wood was used to make bows, doors, tables, tool handles, and even fence posts. Families would cut and sell this wood for the decent amount of money you would make, as even despite the Depression, demand for this was always there. We take the radio for granted today, but it was a shoulder to lean on back in the 30s when all the chaos was really enveloping America. It was hard to have fun during the Depression, which is so accurately named. If one even had the money to spare on a night out or a good meal, then rarely did everyone in the family have the energy. Even watching the TV was not a given in every household because, for some of them, the bill was just out of the picture. Radio programs still managed to stay as a stable routine part of people's lives that would not go away, and that made radio shows a lot more popular too, since listening to the local station was back like never before. Shows like Amos and Andy or Fibber McGee and Molly, as well as the hit melodies of Kate Smith. The local sports would also play, letting listeners tune into popular boxing matches going on at the time. Boxing got really popular back then too after the war, so there were no shortage of programs like the American Archive of Public Broadcasting that regularly kept putting them on the radio. The point is, there was something for everybody to listen to as they could unwind to take their mind off of things. Connecticut was also one of those places that happened to be lucky because of where it was. It's in times like this you learn the importance of territorial advantages, kids. For Connecticut, its plus point was being right next to the coast, which meant that they would always have a steady supply of clams and fish. Clam chowder was something that people there were already used to eating, especially most of the labor force, which were fishermen, so it wasn't too much of a change for them. But what was a pretty jarring thing to adapt to was how little they could get for those same clams and fish now compared to like a year ago. Waldorf salad had humble beginnings and was commonly found in the Waldorf Astoria cookbooks, and as you may have figured, gets its name from there as well. However, by the time of the 20s, this had become a go-to lunch for almost every state in America. Its popularity could not be overstated, and this was because the dish could be very versatile. You could serve it at tables for presidents or as a healthy family meal. It usually consisted of celery salad and mayo, with nuts and fruits like grapes. Besides the parties of the top elite, this was very common for neighborhood get-togethers, as well as every part of America had their own spin on the dish. Few Depression-era meals evoke nostalgia quite like the hearty duo known as beans and cornbread. In homes where budgets were stretched thin, pairing protein-packed beans with simple, inexpensive cornbread wasn't just tasty, it was brilliantly practical. Dried beans, easy to store, and remarkably affordable, found their match in cornbread, made with cheap cornmeal readily available in nearly every pantry. Here's where creativity born from necessity truly shined. Cooks would simmer beans slowly, sometimes flavoring them cleverly with bacon scraps or garden-grown herbs, turning limited supplies into deeply satisfying comfort food. Interestingly, cornbread had a dual role. Not only did it stretch a meal to feed extra mouths, but leftover cornbread was frequently repurposed, crumbled into soups, stews, or transformed into next-day stuffing. Talk about reducing waste and maximizing resources. Food historians have noted this humble pairing provided crucial nutrients too, ensuring struggling families stayed nourished despite financial hardships. Beans and cornbread even inspired a beloved jazz classic in the 1940s, capturing American hearts and stomachs in song, a sure sign of its enduring significance. Families in the Depression had a love-hate relationship with beans. They might have groaned at their constant appearance but couldn't deny the beans' wallet-friendly virtues. Out of necessity, home cooks creatively reimagined this humble legume, crafting hearty dishes like the bean loaf with tomato sauce, a meatloaf look-alike minus the meat. Instead of pricey ground beef, mashed beans took center stage, mixed cleverly with breadcrumbs, onions, and seasonings to mimic texture and flavor. Tomato sauce, generously spooned over top, was often homemade from canned tomatoes, stretching ingredients even further and adding essential moisture and richness. Interestingly, dried beans were so affordable and nutrient-rich that Depression-era government agencies promoted them heavily, distributing free recipe books highlighting dishes like bean loaves to help struggling families. Clever substitutions were key. Eggs, used to bind traditional loaves, were replaced by soaked breadcrumbs or oatmeal, a clever trick still useful today. Although bean loaf might not inspire enthusiastic applause at contemporary potlucks in the 1930s, it symbolized ingenuity and resilience, proving beans could become delicious comfort food, even if reluctantly embraced. Oatmeal pie emerged as the poor family's answer to pecan pie, substituting humble oats for nuts that had become impossibly expensive. The filling combined oats with corn syrup or molasses, eggs, butter, and vanilla, creating texture and sweetness remarkably similar to pecan pies wealthier families enjoyed. Baked until the top turned golden and slightly crunchy, while the interior stayed gooey, oatmeal pie delivered satisfaction exceeding its modest cost. The recipe spread through communities where pecan trees did not grow, and store-bought nuts were beyond family budgets. Women shared it at church gatherings, proud of solving the problem of making fancy pie without fancy ingredients. Children receiving a slice at Christmas dinner experienced the same joy as those eating the original. Oatmeal pie represented both practical necessity and culinary creativity, proving that substitution could produce something genuinely delicious and teaching families that holiday traditions could be maintained regardless of economic circumstances. Hominy and bacon casserole offered hearty satisfaction with minimal ingredients, highlighting how resourcefulness defined many mid-century meals. Creamy canned hominy provided a naturally sweet base that absorbed the smoky flavor of crisp bacon bits sprinkled throughout. A light sauce of milk and butter bound everything together before baking, creating a dish with comforting richness despite its simplicity. Families often served it as a main course with a side of green vegetables or a slice of cornbread, making it a complete and inexpensive dinner. Hominy's long shelf life and low price made it a dependable pantry staple, while just a few strips of bacon added enough depth to please meat lovers without straining the budget. The casserole reheated beautifully, so leftovers were welcomed for quick lunches the next day. Its combination of smooth texture and smoky taste made it popular at potlucks and church gatherings where thrifty recipes were always appreciated. Hominy and bacon casserole remains a testament to how modest ingredients can deliver true comfort and memorable flavor when prepared with care and creativity. Oatmeal meat stretching was not about fooling anyone, it was about feeding everyone. When a pound of ground meat had to serve a family of 6, something had to give. The trick was to cook oats just enough so they were soft, then fold them into the meat mixture with salt, pepper, and maybe a bit of onion. The oats bulked up the meat, absorbing juices and holding everything together in meatloaf, patties, or croquettes. The taste did not change much, but the yield nearly doubled. This method made its way into thousands of Depression-era dinners, not as a gimmick, but as a lifesaver. It meant one piece of meat could stretch into 3 meals. For kids, it was just dinner. For parents, it was peace of mind. You could even season the oats first for extra flavor, or mix in an egg if you were lucky enough to have one. Leftovers were sliced cold or reheated in a pan, crisped at the edges and served again. Oatmeal made meat go further, and going further was the only way to survive. That stretch, that little bit extra, kept the table full when money and meat were running low. Salmon kalibiak is a dish of luxury, with salmon fillet wrapped in puff pastry, along with rice and mushrooms, originating from Russia where it's known as kulebyaka. The name stems from the Russian word for a type of rich, filled pie. The traditional setup lays a seasoned salmon fillet on a bed of cooked rice and mushrooms, then envelops it in puff pastry, which bakes to a golden flakiness. This dish became popular in the banquet menus of European royalty and was featured in several Russian novels. Celebrated in France during the 19th century and beloved for special occasions, salmon kalibiak is often served with vegetables or a light salad. The blend of ingredients inside the pastry creates a sophisticated, hearty meal that showcases the culinary crossover between Russian robustness and French finesse. During the Great Depression, resourcefulness often meant making every calorie of energy and every bit of heat work double duty. The fireless cooker was a brilliant example of this efficiency. Families would heat up a pot of food on the stove, then transfer it still hot into a homemade insulated container packed with blankets, hay, or even straw. The retained heat would finish cooking the meal, saving precious fuel while keeping the container, and often the surrounding area, warm for hours. It was like an early version of the slow cooker, but without the plug. This was a nod to the ingenuity of the time. Fuel was scarce, so using retained heat allowed families to stretch their resources as far as possible. It also had a touch of environmental awareness, though not by choice. By conserving wood or coal, people were unintentionally embracing sustainability long before it became a buzzword. These makeshift cookers also created moments of togetherness. Families would gather around the fireless cooker, eagerly waiting for a warm stew or porridge to be ready. Today, it's a reminder of how creative problem-solving and a little teamwork can go a long way. Plus, who wouldn't appreciate a kitchen hack that saves money and keeps you warm? Cucumber vinegar salad was a refreshing Depression-era side dish that added brightness to otherwise plain meals. Cucumbers were easy to grow in home gardens, and when combined with vinegar, water, and a pinch of sugar or salt, they became a simple but flavorful salad. Thinly sliced and chilled if possible, the cucumbers soaked up the tangy brine and provided crunch. For families living on beans, bread, and potatoes, this salad was a welcome change in texture and taste. It required almost no cooking, which was another benefit when fuel and time were scarce. Often served in large bowls at supper, it gave the sense of a fresh vegetable dish without requiring expensive ingredients. Sometimes onions or dill were added, but the core recipe was basic and thrifty. For many households, cucumber vinegar salad was a reminder that gardening and resourcefulness could provide something close to luxury in the hardest times. But hey, let's say you don't happen to have a couple of handy rivers to water your soil and grow your trees and food naturally. What do? In wetlands in the Deep South, people often ate mayhaw. It was pretty typical swamp fare, too. Mayhaws would grow best in flooded woodlands and swampy riverbanks. You'd think nothing worth eating would grow in an environment like that, but their natural resistance to wet soil ended up making them ideal for it. It also meant that they were great for foraging during the Depression because, despite the harsh conditions, these fruits were some tough customers. They would still stay edible. They were resistant to disease. They could still serve in low-quality acidic soil. And when you ate them, you didn't have to just settle for some fruit you picked up from a swamp. You could actually make jelly out of mayhaw, which helped people stretch their supplies and save their strawberry jam for when it really counted. They were low-calorie, so they weren't that good for energy like pawpaw, but they were pretty medicinal. They came in handy in folk remedies for heart health and circulation. The biggest reason people ate these was probably because they came in early spring, and besides, the sigh of the small red fruits ripening was relieving to some. Wearing hand-me-downs was actually incredibly common during the Depression. A lot of people really could not afford how expensive clothes were becoming. and a big part of that was due to the shortage in fabric that we just talked about, thanks to both the war and the current crisis. In fact, it was pretty usual for people to even pawn off personal jewelry like wedding rings for a measly $5 just to be able to buy shoes. A lot of people would also donate to the homeless when they could, as at least 1 or 2 items would work. Shoes would be resoled with nails, rubber soles would be glued on, stockings and dresses, shirts and shorts and pants, all kinds of clothing items would be passed down, from elder sibling to the younger, or from parent to child. This was how people managed to get by during a time that Americans never wished to remember, and some of these wardrobes were milked dry until every last bit of fabric came undone. But what else was a person to do? Georgia had Hoppin' Johns, which was a piece of culture that was taken from the Gullah people, an African-American tribe that had a long-established presence in the state. Their cooking methods relied a lot on natural, organic food. Fruits, peas, beans, stuff like that. That's why there was such an interest from the broader community into how they cooked things, because they wanted to know how to make the best use of ingredients like that too. Luckily, the Hoppin' John recipe spread enough that it became a household name. It was really just rice and peas, but it was homely and cozy, feelings that you just could not get during the Depression. Depression cake and war cake are just a few of the titles this cake has. It proved that even if things were economically bad, people still had a sweet tooth. It was not just a silly craving, but a sign of comfort and a reminder of more normal days. After all, actual cake was way out of the question when people had to live off of $5 a week and feed their entire families along with it. Depression cake, as glum as it sounds, was a very welcome addition to most people's baking roster since it substituted milk with water, baking powder with eggs, and shortening instead of butter. This significantly reduced the cost of making a cake, and it was one of the things that started mock cuisine in America. Long before pancakes became a diner staple, Depression-era families turned to Johnny Cakes, a humble cornmeal-based flatbread, as a trusted source of inexpensive nourishment. Originally introduced by early American settlers, Johnny Cakes saw a resurgence during the Depression, becoming popular again due to their affordability and accessibility. Made from little more than cornmeal, salt, and water or milk, this simple batter transformed into golden, crispy patties that creatively replaced costly ingredients like wheat flour or eggs. Resourceful home cooks often pan-fried Johnny Cakes in leftover bacon grease or saved drippings from other meals, cleverly reducing waste and maximizing resources. Families got creative, too. Some would sweeten these cakes slightly with molasses or honey, while others spiced them up with savory leftovers, stretching a modest meal into something memorable. Food historians share an amusing anecdote. Because cornmeal was abundant and dirt cheap, some folks humorously called Johnny Cakes the poor man's pancake, a nickname many wore proudly, turning frugality into a source of culinary pride. In an era when your grocery list often looked more like a wish list, home cooks discovered clever ways to elevate pantry staples into potluck stars. One such creation was the hominy and tomato bake, an ingenious casserole that turned humble canned hominy into an inviting, family-friendly dish. Hominy, essentially corn kernels soaked in an alkali solution, had long been an inexpensive source of nourishment. Paired with canned tomatoes, it provided vital nutrition while remaining affordable. Thrifty cooks layered these ingredients generously with seasoned breadcrumbs, a smart trick to stretch portions, providing texture and bulk without straining the budget. To replace the pricier cheese, homemakers often enhance this casserole's flavor using homegrown herbs or leftover bacon drippings, showcasing a Depression-era knack for turning scarcity into flavor. Interestingly, hominy wasn't just affordable. It was versatile, appearing regularly in soups, stews, and even desserts during tough economic times. Although some modern palates might consider canned hominy a relic, the casserole's rustic charm and cozy, nostalgic flavor kept it popular well beyond the 1930s, appearing in community cookbooks into the mid-century. Vinegar pie carried the tang of desperation transformed into something surprisingly delicious on Depression Christmas tables. When lemons were impossible to afford and fruit fillings remained a distant memory, families discovered that plain white vinegar could provide the tartness needed for a satisfying custard pie. The filling combined vinegar with sugar, eggs, butter, and flour, creating a custard that baked into something resembling lemon pie without the expense of citrus. The taste was sharp and sweet, with a silky texture that fooled many into thinking real fruit had been used. Mothers baked these pies in the same tins their grandmothers had used, continuing traditions even when ingredients changed. Children ate their slices without complaint, grateful for any dessert on the holiday table. The recipe required nothing beyond basic pantry staples, making it accessible to even the poorest households. Vinegar pie taught that substitution was not defeat, but creativity, proving Christmas dessert could survive any hardship. Mock banana pudding was the sort of dish that showed just how inventive Depression-era cooks could be when real ingredients were simply out of reach. Bananas, once imported luxuries, quickly became too expensive for families to buy. To make up for it, people leaned on banana extract, which could be purchased cheaply and used sparingly to add flavor, layered with homemade custard, when eggs and milk could be spared, and stacked between vanilla wafers or leftover bits of stale cake. The pudding felt surprisingly close to the original. Families would chill it in an icebox if they had one, though often it was served warm right from the stove. For children, it was a rare treat that offered the illusion of a fruit dessert, even if no fresh fruit was present. In many homes, mock banana pudding became a stand-in for celebration desserts, stretching scarce supplies into something families could still enjoy together, and for many, it carried the sweetness of hope itself. Eggless mayonnaise might sound like a contradiction, but during the Great Depression, it was a lifesaver. Real eggs were expensive and risky to store without refrigeration, so resourceful cooks found another way. The trick involved boiling flour, sugar, vinegar, water, and a little mustard powder into a thick paste, then whisking in oil slowly as it cooled. The result was creamy, tangy, and just firm enough to mimic the real thing. It was used in potato salads, sandwiches, and anywhere a dollop of mayo was needed. While it lacked the richness of yolks, it held its own in terms of flavor and texture. It was cheap, safe to keep, and easy to make with pantry staples. Some versions added condensed milk for sweetness or lemon juice for brightness. Others were purely savory. It was not gourmet, but it made a humble lunch feel more complete. And for families trying to make the most of what little they had, eggless mayo turned barely enough into just right. Long before store-bought bread was an everyday staple, cornmeal was the backbone of many working-class meals. Cheap, shelf-stable, and endlessly versatile, it found its way into countless recipes, none more practical than corn dodgers. These simple golden brown dumplings were either fried to crisp perfection or baked until firm, then served with a drizzle of syrup or a pat of butter. Corn dodgers were a direct descendant of Depression-era survival cooking, when wheat flour was too expensive for daily use. Cornmeal, on the other hand, was affordable and widely available, especially in the South and Midwest. Mixed with a little water, salt, and sometimes a splash of milk, it formed a dough sturdy enough to hold its shape in the frying pan. The result was a crispy on the outside, tender on the inside bite of pure comfort. Paired with a bit of molasses or honey, whatever was on hand, it became a meal that kids actually looked forward to. Some families made them dense and chewy, while others leaned toward a lighter, almost hush-puppy-like texture. However they were served, one thing was certain. Corn dodgers proved that even the simplest ingredients could be transformed into something satisfying. No frills, no waste, just good, honest food. When the cold winds of the Great Depression swept through poorly insulated homes, many families had to think outside the box. To conserve heat, homemade insulation became a popular and clever fix. Families used newspapers, old rags, cardboard, and even scrap fabric to seal windows, doors, and walls. The goal was simple: keep the warmth in and the chill out. Newspaper, in particular, became a go-to material, as it was inexpensive and abundant, often found piled up in every corner of the house. The ingenuity behind this practice is impressive. People repurposed anything they could find, even turning old coat linings into makeshift window covers. In rural areas, nature contributed with extra layers of hay or straw for insulation, often packed around window frames or used in the walls of barns. These methods were not only about conserving heat, they were about making every inch of the home as efficient as possible. Families worked together, tackling one drafty room at a time, bonding over shared tasks in the process. Today, this frugality is a reminder that sometimes the most resourceful solutions are the simplest, and often the most effective. In fact, homemade insulation is still a viable option in areas where modern insulation can be costly. Boiled turnip tops were a staple born of necessity, proving that even the green leaves most people might throw away could keep families alive. Turnips were affordable, hardy vegetables that grew well in poor soil, and when their roots were harvested, the greens were never wasted. Women would wash and boil the tops in a simple pot of water, sometimes seasoning only with a pinch of salt if they had it. The greens cooked down into a soft, bitter but nutritious dish that helped fill stomachs when nothing else was available. Occasionally, if there was bacon fat or lard to spare, the leaves would be flavored more richly, but most of the time it was plain boiled greens. Children often disliked the taste, but parents insisted, knowing the vitamins were essential in years when fresh vegetables were rare. For many rural households, boiled turnip tops became a daily food, reminding them of how survival depended on using every single part of the harvest. Now, medlar is something that people were unfamiliar with unless they were from Europe. It was a lot more common to see it there than it was in the United States. Medlars were the opposite of both. These little fruits would love rocky soil, which meant that they were great winter fruits. You'd see them in the northeastern areas the most. What they were also really good for was providing some much-needed fiber. Now, fiber's good for keeping your belly full, but it's also invaluable in helping digestion and preventing anemia. When people ate things back then, they didn't think of just how they tasted, how they'd help the supplies last longer, or how they'd save money. They also thought about what each fruit could do and its different benefits. People would use the tannins of medlars to help treat diarrhea too, which really goes to show you how innovative people were during the Depression. The next time your grandpa tells you to just figure it out, maybe he's talking from experience. Next up is the infamous garbage plate. Before you start raising eyebrows because of the name of this one, just hear me out. So this was basically a mishmash of whatever was on hand. Imagine a plate filled to the brim with macaroni salad, home fries, baked beans, and some kind of protein like sausage or ground beef. And don't forget the toppings: chili, onions, mustard, and your choice of hot sauce or ketchup. Sounds appetizing, right? The garbage plate originated in 1918, the garbage plate, and became the signature dish of Rochester. If you missed out on it, don't fret, because it's still served by numerous restaurants under names such as Rochester Plate, Trash Plate, or Simply Plate. This meal was a classic when wallets were tight back in the day and there weren't many gourmet options on hand. Plus, it had all the carbs and fats you needed to keep going through tough times, and the kids loved it. What's not to love about fries and macaroni? This dish is a classic example of don't judge a book by its cover, or in this case, by its name. Amid the widespread struggles of the Great Depression, families turned kitchen staples into culinary innovation, and a standout was a surprisingly sweet yet humble dish known simply as butter and sugar noodles. Pasta, butter, sugar, three affordable ingredients commonly stashed in Depression-era pantries, came together to transform mundane noodles into something unexpectedly comforting and satisfying. This creative approach, driven entirely by necessity, exemplifies how families cleverly adapted to limitations without compromising taste. An interesting twist was that leftover pasta from dinner often made a comeback the next day as a sweetened breakfast, effectively reducing waste and maximizing resources. Affordability and accessibility were vital, and this sweet noodle dish quickly became a favorite because of its simplicity and budget-friendly nature. Sure, nowadays the concept might make a gourmet chef cringe, but back then, those sugary noodles felt like dessert disguised as dinner, an acceptable indulgence when treats were scarce. Parents occasionally sprinkled cinnamon or nutmeg on top, convincing skeptical children that they were eating something far more exciting than just buttered pasta with sugar. Biscuits have long been staples at American dinner tables, but during the Great Depression, traditional wheat flour biscuits became luxuries families could rarely afford. Ingeniously, home cooks turned to cornmeal, cheap, filling, and abundantly available, to bake cornmeal biscuits with syrup, a comforting alternative that kept everyone satisfied. Cornmeal, originally a Native American staple, gained renewed popularity in the Depression, not only because it was economical, but also due to its nutritional value, providing essential fiber and vitamins at a fraction of the cost. With sugar scarce and expensive, resourceful cooks substituted molasses or homemade syrups to sweeten these biscuits, imparting a delightful caramelized flavor that elevated a simple meal into something special. Bakers cleverly blended modest amounts of wheat flour with cornmeal to keep texture tender without breaking tight budgets. Surprisingly, syrup-sweetened cornmeal biscuits became not only a side dish but also an occasional dessert, proving that versatility was indeed a Depression-era virtue. Water pie was the desperate dessert that turned almost nothing into something sweet enough for Christmas dinner. When families could not afford eggs, milk, butter, or fruit, this pie emerged from sheer necessity and stubborn determination to have dessert on the holiday table. The filling was astonishingly simple: water, sugar, flour, vanilla, and small amount of butter mixed together and poured into a pie crust. During baking, the mixture transformed into custard-like filling that was surprisingly satisfying. The pie had other names in different regions: Depression pie, Desperation pie, names carrying the weight of era's hardship. Children eating this pie often never knew how little it contained, only that mother had made them Christmas dessert. The crust could be made from lard and flour, ingredients even the poorest pantries usually held. Water pie represented the absolute bottom of Depression experience, yet also represented triumph, love and determination, creating celebration from virtually nothing at all. Spam and eggs were the emergency dinner that never felt like one. Spam was the meat that came in a tiny rectangular can, and once you heard that suction sound as it slid out, you knew what was coming. You sliced it thick or thin, fried it in a pan until it crisped at the edges, and served it alongside scrambled eggs that may or may not have come from a powder. It was salty, greasy, and surprisingly good, if you grew up eating it, that is. Some people looked down on Spam, but when money was tight, Spam was a lifesaver. It had a long shelf life, required no refrigeration, and could be stretched across several meals. It showed up in casseroles, sandwiches, and stews, but next to eggs, it felt like breakfast for dinner, which somehow made everything okay. You would douse it in ketchup or hot sauce, whatever you had, and you would eat it at a small table with mismatched chairs and flickering lights and think, this could be worse, and it often was. Vinegar as a tenderizer was one of those tricks that quietly revolutionized Depression-era cooking. Tough cuts of meat were often all you could afford, gristly, chewy, and almost impossible to enjoy unless you knew how to treat them right. That is where vinegar came in. Just a quick soak in a vinegar-based marinade would soften the meat, break down the fibers, and help it absorb flavor. You did not need anything fancy. A splash of vinegar, a little salt, and maybe some dried herbs if you had them. Let it sit for a few hours or overnight, and suddenly that cheap cut of meat became something worth savoring. It was not about masking the toughness, it was about transforming it. Vinegar brought out the best in whatever you had, and it worked just as well on vegetables too. You would see it used in greens, stews, and even in boiled dishes to brighten up bland or starchy flavors. It became a staple because it was affordable, shelf-stable, and incredibly versatile. And the best part? It gave home cooks a sense of control when everything else felt uncertain. Pork belly with cracklings is celebrated for its luxurious flavors and contrasting textures derived from the rich layers of meat and fat found in pork belly. The preparation process starts with scoring the skin and massaging it with a blend of salt, pepper, and aromatic herbs or spices to infuse flavor. The meat is slow roasted at a low temperature to render the fat and tenderize the meat, followed by a blast of high heat to crisp the skin into cracklings. This approach ensures the pork belly stays succulent, while the outer skin turns deliciously crisp. Often served sliced thickly and accompanied by applesauce or a cider reduction, this dish perfectly pairs the pork's richness with a touch of sweet acidity. The allure of pork belly with cracklings lies in the depth of its flavors and the satisfying interplay of tender meat with crispy skin. One of the other things that was pushed to the mainstream thanks to the Dust Bowl was the reliance on one-pot meals. During the Great Depression, staying warm often meant stacking blankets, not just one or two, but multiple layers of quilts and blankets to trap heat. This was an ingenious, straightforward approach to insulating beds without the luxury of central heating or thick comforters. Families would gather every piece of fabric they had, old woolen blankets, quilts passed down through generations, even makeshift covers like cloth sacks or tablecloths, creating a makeshift fortress against the cold. The frugality of this practice couldn't be overstated. Not only did it maximize the warmth of what little bedding they had, but it also ensured that nothing went to waste. Even worn-out or damaged blankets were patched together to create additional layers. The simple, layered bedding system was a resourceful solution, leveraging the power of insulation through fabric. Of course, the environment played a role here too. In rural areas, families often had to use what they could find, whether it was sheepskin or fabric scraps, to bolster their layers. This practice also encouraged community bonding. Family members would work together, adding layers to the beds and sharing stories late into the night, wrapped up in warmth and togetherness. Ketchup sandwiches may sound like a joke today, but in the Depression era, they were a quick meal for children and adults alike. With meat out of reach for many, a slice of bread spread thin with ketchup became lunch or even dinner. The tangy, sweet flavor gave the illusion of something more filling, especially when paired with a second slice of bread. Sometimes butter or margarine was added if available, but most of the time it was just bread and ketchup. While humble, it provided calories when little else was around, and children often looked forward to it simply because it tasted different from the usual plain bread. It was also portable, making it an easy option for workers or school lunches. Though it might not sound appetizing now, it kept hunger away for countless families. For many who grew up in the 1930s, ketchup sandwiches became an unforgettable part of their childhood survival. Huckleberries were one of the most prized wild berries you could find during the Depression. For people who grew up living in the mountainous regions of the Pacific Northwest, it was a treasure fruit. These little bastards were related to blueberries, but they had a more intense flavor than blueberries could ever hope to have. Huckleberries ranged from sweet to slightly tart-like, but they always had wine-like notes. Sounds luxurious, right? Huckleberries were really cultivated. They were almost entirely harvested in the wild and used in domestication, making them a really prized treat. Huckleberries were packed with all sorts of nutritional content too. Vitamin C, manganese, you name it. They were scarce, with an explosive and strong flavor. They were also a cash crop. During peak harvest season, foragers would go out in droves to pick out huckleberries, even going deep into the mountains to get a good haul. They'd sell these at local markets or to restaurants instead of hoarding it for themselves. But when they did, people made pies and syrups out of it. Sometimes they sold that too. Other times, people kept what they had made for themselves and their family. It became common for huckleberries to even become somewhat of a currency in some places because of their potential for bartering. One of the things that really took a while for Americans to get used to, at least those in the urban cities, was the concept of thrift gardens. These are not bazaars filled with thrift stores, or centers where you could recycle cheap reusable clothing, but community gardens where people could grow their own food. The idea here was that there was a lot of empty space being taken up by parking lots and other plots of land that were just sitting there without being used. That's one thing. Now we have the second, which was a massive shortage of produce due to both inflation and a very first-come, first-served mentality that took root among the people. Now, you put two and two together, and you get thrift gardens. A very clever solution to the problem that not only let people grow their own food and waste less money, but also helped them barter. So it worked as a source of income in those times too. These were particularly popular in cities like Detroit, where an entire thrift garden program helped to raise enough food for around 20,000 people. Speaking of cakes, hot water cornbread was also a not-so-close but close enough alternative to your regular layered delights. It was made in a pan, and the batter was shaped into cakes before being fried in hot fat to add that iconic crisp that nothing else had. Seriously, this thing gave fried chicken burgers a run for their money in retrospect. Then some salt and boiling water was all you needed. It had a perfectly crisp exterior that crumbled in your mouth perfectly, while the inside was tender, warm, and very reminiscent of Grandma's cooking. Probably why it caught on as much as it did, since most of these ingredients managed to get the long end of the stick with inflation. While egg drop soup might evoke images of your favorite Chinese takeout, Depression-era Americans had their own inventive take on this classic dish. When times got tough and wallets got thinner, families turned to an American-style egg drop soup, cleverly crafted from simple ingredients that were affordable and accessible. Usually it was nothing more than broth, often just salted water, if we're honest, with a single precious egg carefully beaten and slowly drizzled into the simmering liquid. The egg stretched surprisingly far, forming delicate ribbons that turned plain broth into something more substantial. Food historians note that cooks, driven by creativity born from necessity, occasionally enhanced the soup by sneaking in leftover vegetables or even stale bread crusts, brilliantly reducing waste and maximizing resources. There's even an old joke from the era. Families humorously called it egg drop soup because that's exactly what they did. Drop in one egg, cross their fingers, and hope nobody noticed the absence of meat. Despite its humble composition, the warm broth offered important nutrients and protein, essential during a time when these were scarce. During the Great Depression, vegetables like carrots and potatoes were kitchen VIPs, not because of glamour, but sheer affordability and availability. The humble yet flavorful carrot and potato bake, a casserole of thinly sliced potatoes combined with brightly grated carrots, became a potluck favorite precisely because it cleverly stretched ingredients without sacrificing nutrition or taste. To keep budgets intact, thrifty cooks relied on simple additions like flour, thickened milk, or leftover broth instead of costly cream, and seasoned it sparingly with homegrown herbs or scraps of onion, turning basic veggies into something delightfully savory. Interestingly, carrots, high in vitamin A, gained popularity during tough economic times, not only because they were cheap, but they also boosted nutrition at a time when balanced diets seemed harder than balancing checkbooks. Potato slices baked tenderly alongside carrots delivered comforting carbs and vital nutrients, creating an unexpectedly hearty dish without meat or expensive dairy. Families attending potluck gatherings eagerly welcomed casseroles like this, a nutritious yet inexpensive way to ensure everyone left the dinner full, even if wallets stayed empty. Mock apple pie was the miracle dessert that fooled everyone at the Christmas table, made entirely without a single apple in sight. When fresh fruit became a luxury most families could not afford, clever cooks discovered that Ritz crackers soaked in a syrup of water, sugar, cream of tartar, and lemon juice transformed into something tasting remarkably like real apple pie. The crackers absorbed the spiced liquid, swelling and softening until they achieved the exact texture of cooked apples. Families baked these pies in cast-iron skillets, serving them warm with whatever cream the household could spare. Children often had no idea they were eating crackers instead of fruit, their faces lighting up at the familiar Christmas flavors of cinnamon and nutmeg. The recipe spread through church bulletins and word of mouth between neighbors sharing survival strategies. Mock apple pie represented Depression ingenuity, proving that holiday traditions could survive even when orchards were bare and grocery money had vanished. Fried rice was the kitchen's answer to, "What can I do with leftovers?" You took yesterday's rice, never fresh, always cold, and tossed it in a hot pan with oil. Add eggs if you had them. Add vegetables if they were not wilted. Add soy sauce and stir until everything sizzled. Sometimes there was meat, bits of chicken, strips of Spam, leftover pork chops cut into tiny pieces. It was not a recipe. It was a response to scarcity. Every ingredient was a compromise that somehow came together as comfort. You learned to make it without measuring, without rules, just instinct and need. But often, it was just rice and hope. Fried rice was the clean-out-the-fridge dish, the we cannot waste anything dish. It was salty, savory, and never tasted the same way twice. But it always worked. It fed a crowd, it reheated well, and it made you feel like a real cook, even if all you did was throw things in a pan. Water pie trick was the kind of invention you only believe once you taste it. Made from water, sugar, flour, and a bit of butter or lard if you had it, The mixture set into a sweet, custard-like filling as it baked. It was strange and magical, a pie with no fruit, no eggs, no milk, but still somehow soft and sliceable. You poured the mix into a simple crust, maybe even a cracker crust, and baked until it barely jiggled. Cinnamon or vanilla could be added for flavor, but even plain, it worked. Some called it desperation pie. Others just called it dessert. It was born out of bare cupboards and stubbornness, the need to bring something sweet to the table when nothing sweet remained, and it proved that even in the leanest moments, a little sugar and flour could still create something worth serving. During the Great Depression, finding enough fuel to keep warm was no easy task. But people living through the hardship didn't sit idly by. They made use of whatever nature had to offer. Scraps of wood, fallen branches, or discarded building materials became valuable resources for heating homes. In rural areas, families would regularly head out to gather firewood from the forest floor, while urban dwellers scavenged through construction sites or abandoned buildings for usable scraps. The ingenuity of these families was remarkable. They knew that every piece of wood could serve a purpose, whether it was used for cooking or simply keeping the house warm. The environment played a huge role in this process. Forests were often the go-to for firewood in rural regions, while in cities, abandoned lots and old fences were repurposed. And it wasn't only the adults who got involved, children helped too, making this a family affair that brought everyone together for a common goal. As modern society grapples with waste and environmental concerns, the Depression-era practice of collecting scrap wood offers a powerful reminder of just how far a little resourcefulness can go in warming both hearts and homes. In the pot liquor with cornbread was a Southern tradition that became a Depression-era favorite because it stretched nothing into something filling. Pot liquor was the nutrient-rich broth left over after boiling greens like collards, turnip tops, or mustard greens. Instead of throwing it away, families would crumble cornbread into the liquid and eat it like a soup. It was packed with vitamins and minerals, even if it cost almost nothing to make. For poor families, it was a way to turn scraps into a full meal. It also carried a sense of comfort, with the familiar flavors of the greens and the cornbread blending together into something that felt substantial. Often it was eaten for dinner when nothing else was left in the pantry, but it still provided strength and nourishment. Many remembered it fondly as both survival food and comfort food, proving that even the simplest things could be cherished. The Depression era wasn't a time that was marked just by economic ruin, but also environmental destruction thanks to the Dust Bowl. A lot of soil was damaged, so fruits like persimmons, which thrived in poor soil, became essential. You'd see these growing on rocky hillsides, and true to the brand, they were rich in minerals, particularly potassium, which helped when bananas weren't around. They also packed quite a lot of vitamins A and C, which helped keep cases of scurvy in check back in the day. However, that was only the tip of the iceberg. Persimmon could offer more than just basic nutrition. They were good at keeping you active and providing you comfort. How did they do this, you ask? Persimmons, at least fully ripe ones, are incredible sources of sugar. Just one contains the equivalent of a modern energy bar. When people would go out foraging, especially in the Midwest and Southeast where persimmons were naturally growing, they'd always keep an eye out for them. You could also make pudding out of the fruit, which was a real comfort for people who hadn't had something like that in a while. The seeds were also really helpful because when you roasted them, you could ground and brew them as a substitute for coffee beans. So, all in all, this was one fruit you always wanted in your bag, no matter what your situation was. Passing by the time when you have very little money to go out and do anything, plus even less time as family responsibilities would be at your door constantly, was an art in and of itself. Especially in the 30s, and would you believe how people did it? Miniature golf of all things. Maybe you were expecting some potluck where people got together and drowned their sorrows in the bottle, but people actually got really crazy about mini golf throughout the 30s. Yeah, they could not afford actual courses or sign up in any clubs, but people would build courses out of whatever materials they could find or buy. Cans, holes in the road, wooden posts, anything worked so long as it vaguely resembled a course. Then all you needed was a bat and a ball and you were good to go. It is reassuring that no matter how dark the times, people find a way to keep fun alive, yeah? Alaska, on the other hand, was luckier. They had the privilege of being next to bodies of water, so they could actually catch their food hunter-gatherer style and essentially eat for free. Subsistence living became the normal lifestyle that people incorporated into their weekly routines, and one of the best ways to sustain an entire family and take advantage of the bounty of nature was fish and game stews. Any kind of stew would work. It wouldn't really be a proper recipe, and a lot of the time it would just be using whatever hands-on ingredients they could come up with. But hey, it filled everyone's bowl. Nobody could ever hate on a potato croquette, and a lot of people have paid their due respect to the game of these legendary appetizers, and that goes doubly true for the 1920s. Potato croquettes with a side of wings were an incredibly popular combo at many bars and diners, and they were also the go-to snack of many teenagers before or after school. Maybe you cannot imagine spending your Wednesday in either of those contexts. Okay, so let's say you have a party or want to throw one. One of the best munching options were potato croquettes because they made for great conversation food. That is a term we came up with to refer to food that really helps the flow of a conversation go by smoother. And there was nothing like talking the evening away with a good friend over a fresh batch of some croquettes. Few dishes better capture the ingenuity of Depression-era cooks than bologna and rice casserole, an inventive marriage of modest ingredients that was both filling and budget-friendly. Rice was cheap, available nearly everywhere, and could stretch even the most limited pantries, while bologna, well, let's just say it wasn't winning culinary awards, but it certainly scored high marks for affordability and accessibility. Interestingly, the casserole's popularity was boosted by the era's government relief programs, which often provided surplus bologna to struggling families. Ever-resourceful home cooks quickly realized the processed meat's potential, combining thin slices or chopped bits with rice, canned tomatoes, and occasionally leftover vegetables lurking in their ice boxes, expertly reducing waste and maximizing resources. Food historians point out that clever homemakers might dress up this casserole by layering in spices or sneaking in leftover cheese, a creative touch born purely from necessity. A running joke at dinner tables was that bologna and rice casserole was the great equalizer. Since wealthy or poor, no one was immune from the economic pinch, and apparently bologna didn't discriminate either. When you're tasked with feeding hungry neighbors during a time when meat was scarce and fresh ingredients were luxuries, creativity was the secret sauce to making a meal memorable. In stepped the tomato aspic salad, a quirky gelatin mold born from pantry staples, which became surprisingly popular at Depression-era potlucks. Home cooks combined tangy tomato juice, often canned or preserved, with economical vegetables like celery, onions, and peppers suspended delicately in gelatin. Since traditional proteins were hard to come by, gelatin provided a sneaky nutritional boost while adding a dash of visual intrigue to the communal table. Housewives cleverly substituted fresh tomatoes with inexpensive canned juice, highlighting how inventive substitutions turned limited pantry stocks into satisfying dishes. This odd yet charming dish embodied the Great Depression's resourcefulness. Each bite was a testament to culinary innovation under pressure. While today gelatin salads might get side eyes at gatherings, in the 1930s presenting a wobbly tomato-flavored mold was both practical and fashionable, an affordable luxury amidst hardship. Cornmeal mush served as Christmas breakfast for countless families who had little else to start the holiday morning. Ground corn was the cheapest grain available during the Depression, costing mere pennies for enough to feed a family for days. The mush was made by slowly stirring cornmeal into boiling water, cooking it until the mixture thickened into a porridge that was both filling and warming. Served hot in deep bowls with molasses drizzled over the top, it provided the energy children needed before the excitement of whatever small Christmas celebrations awaited. Some families added a splash of milk when they could afford it, making the dish slightly richer and more satisfying. The texture was smooth and comforting, the corn flavor honest and familiar. Cornmeal mush represented the absolute basics of survival cooking, yet it carried warmth and nourishment that more expensive foods could not match. For families with nothing else, this simple porridge was Christmas morning itself. Cornmeal dumplings in broth were one of those Depression-era tricks that turned the most modest soup into something that felt like a meal. Flour and wheat were often expensive, but cornmeal remained relatively cheap and widely available. Families would mix cornmeal with water and a little salt to form a simple dough, shaping it into small balls and dropping them into a pot of thin broth. The broth itself could be made from vegetable scraps, meat bones, or even just salted water, but once the dumplings simmered and swelled, the dish felt hearty. Mothers often relied on this trick to stretch a single pot into enough servings for large families. Children loved the dumplings because they had a soft, chewy texture, almost like a treat floating in their soup. Adults valued the filling quality, which helped stave off hunger when no second helpings were possible. Cornmeal dumplings showed the ingenuity of turning something inexpensive and basic into comfort food. In many households, this dish became a staple, remembered later not for its luxury, but for the way it managed to make empty cupboards feel just a little less empty. Breadcrumb coffee cake topping was a clever twist born from necessity and sweet tooth cravings. Butter was a luxury and store-bought streusel was a fantasy, so people turned to the one thing they had plenty of: old bread. Dried out and crumbled into coarse bits, it became the base for a topping that could rival anything from the bakery. You mix the crumbs with sugar and leftover grease, bacon fat, lard, or even schmaltz, and scattered the mix over simple batter before baking. The result was a sweet, savory crust that crisped up beautifully and added texture to every bite. It did not melt like butter would, but it crunched and it clung to the top like a golden halo. Kids loved the crispy bits, and adults appreciated that nothing went to waste. You could season it with cinnamon or nutmeg if those were on hand, but even plain, it worked. It gave plain cakes a little flair, made breakfast feel fancy, and helped turn the most basic ingredients into something memorable. That topping was resourcefulness baked right in. Stuff like vegetable pot pie with a biscuit crust really made the rounds just about everywhere. It was because it was so easy to pool together different kinds of vegetables to make one massive serving of pot pie, oftentimes more than just for a family. People would basically realize this. If they shared the amount of vegetables and resources they had, they could honestly make a lot more. Community-based ingredient sharing and food preparation once again became a thing. Entire neighborhoods were once again eating together, and it was a big part of how people managed to survive. This pot pie was a one-stop solution to massive amounts of hunger, and often people would throw in whatever kind of vegetables they had in there. This would typically look like your average mix of cabbage, onions, garlic, tomatoes, potatoes, and the rest, but people would try to add in aromatics to get some flavor going too. It was little stuff like this that really helped keep things together for everyone because, on their own, people didn't have the energy to cook big meals like this very often. The bitter cold didn't stop people during the Great Depression from heading outside to work, run errands, or simply survive the day. But with many unable to afford new shoes or even warm socks, an inventive solution emerged: stuffing shoes with newspaper or cloth for extra insulation. It was a simple trick that turned worn-out footwear into a small haven of warmth. Shoes were often patched and repatched to last as long as possible, but keeping feet warm required a little extra creativity. Newspapers were readily available and lightweight, while scraps of cloth could be repurposed from old clothing or blankets. This method demonstrated how even the humblest materials could be transformed into tools for survival. The environment played a role, too, as people used whatever natural or man-made resources were readily at hand. Parents often taught their children how to make the stuffing work best, passing down lessons in both thriftiness and resilience. Today, this simple innovation reminds us that solutions don't always have to be complex or expensive. Corncob jelly was one of the most surprising Depression-era creations, turning what was usually discarded into something sweet and useful. After eating or cutting kernels from corn, families would boil the stripped cobs for a long time until the liquid turned golden. With sugar and sometimes pectin, this liquid became a jelly that spread easily on bread or biscuits. It had a mild corn flavor, slightly sweet, and it gave people a way to stretch ingredients without buying fruit for jams. Since sugar was often rationed or expensive, this jelly was seen as a clever way to create a sweet treat out of nothing more than scraps. Many families remembered it fondly, not only because it was thrifty, but because it represented resourcefulness at its finest. Children often spread it on cornbread or stale bread softened in milk, turning waste into dessert. It may seem odd today, but back then it was pure ingenuity. Aronia berries were known as black chokeberries. They were a tenacious fruit that you would find most commonly in acidic soils, cold climates, and poor dry land. This made them the kind of thing that most people wouldn't ever think about growing, but chokeberries happened to be so naturally resistant to their bottom-of-the-barrel surroundings that when they did get planted in decent soil, the results were almost staggering. Most people would dry out their aronia berries and store them for future use, especially throughout the winter months. These dried berries were often added to oatmeal to make a more filling breakfast. Aronia berries became known for their tannic structure, which made them perfect for fermenting at home. This meant that you could produce wine out of it, and it was actually pretty sweet. People even sold it for a pretty penny, at least whatever was considered a pretty penny back then. The Depression left 13 million people unemployed, and that meant there was doomsday in the real estate market too, as a lot of people became homeless. As a result, many kept moving in search of jobs and work wherever they could find it. People would take up any odd job in a county or state over even if it paid half a dollar or $1 more per hour than what they were currently doing. Bartending, waitressing, nursing, lumber work, construction work, all kinds of jobs would require people to leave behind their towns and homes so that they could have a shot at keeping a stable life. For the people who had already lost their homes, they had nowhere else to go besides wherever they could hope to earn some money. Not everyone was lucky enough to fly out of the USA and find shelter from the storm elsewhere, and at one point the situation with the massive drop in interest in permanent residency led home building to drop by 80%. There just was not a point to constructing property anymore, since shantytowns were becoming more and more popular. Plus, people would not be interested in renting out freshly built apartments or homes. Not when there were much cheaper roofs to cover their heads out there. Fried cornmeal mush transformed breakfast leftovers into something resembling Christmas treat when sliced and crisped in hot fat. The mush from morning was poured into loaf pans and allowed to cool until firm enough to slice into thick rounds or rectangles. These slices were then fried in bacon grease, lard, or whatever cooking fat the family had saved, until the outsides turned golden and crispy while the insides stayed soft and warm. Served with molasses, sorghum syrup, or a sprinkle of precious sugar, the fried mush became something children actually looked forward to eating. The contrast between crunchy exterior and creamy interior made each bite interesting, a rare pleasure during times when most food was merely functional. Mothers appreciated that one batch of cornmeal could provide both breakfast and supper, stretching resources across multiple meals. Fried cornmeal mush proved that even the simplest ingredients could be elevated with technique, bringing small moments of joy to Depression-era holiday tables. Barley and mushroom gravy bowl brought hearty texture and deep flavor to the dinner table using ingredients that cost only pennies per serving. Pearl barley was simmered until tender and spooned into bowls, then generously topped with a thick mushroom gravy made from sautéed onions, sliced mushrooms, and a splash of milk or broth. The barley's nutty chewiness paired perfectly with the savory gravy, creating a meal that was both comforting and surprisingly filling. This dish proved that meat was not necessary to achieve a rich, satisfying flavor, making it popular among families seeking economical vegetarian options. Barley stored well and cooked in bulk, so a single bag could supply multiple meals over the week. The recipe also welcomed leftovers, allowing home cooks to add bits of vegetables or herbs on hand without increasing the cost. Served with a simple green salad, barley and mushroom gravy bowl became a quiet star of thrifty 1960s kitchens, showcasing how whole grains and careful seasoning could create a dinner that felt indulgent despite its humble origins. Bacon grease saved in tins was a quiet pillar of Depression-era cooking. Every time bacon hit the pan, the drippings were poured into an old coffee can or mason jar, waiting to be used again. That grease-flavored beans, fried eggs, popped popcorn, and even baked into cornbread. Nothing was wasted. The fat added a smoky depth that plain oil or lard could not match. It solidified into a creamy spread when cooled, and was sometimes smeared on bread in place of butter. In homes where every penny counted, that little tin by the stove was a lifeline. You measured it carefully, used it sparingly, and appreciated every spoonful. Even the smell of it heating up in the pan signaled that something good was coming. Saving bacon grease was not just a habit, it was a system of flavor preservation, one that turned scraps into satisfaction and made basic meals taste bold. Beef bourguignon is a cornerstone from Burgundy, involving marinated and slow-cooked beef chunks, typically tougher cuts like chuck, bathed in red wine, usually Burgundy, to tenderize the meat over several hours. This hearty stew is fortified with onions, garlic, and carrots, and enhanced with sautéed mushrooms and crisp lardons. Historically, this method likely evolved as a means to tenderize and enrich less desirable cuts of meat. The stew develops a rich, deep umami flavor from the Maillard reaction, which occurs as the beef browns, and the complex flavors intensify as the wine slowly melds with the herbs and vegetables. The slow cooking process not only enriches the stew's flavor, but also fills the kitchen with an inviting aromatic warmth, making beef bourguignon synonymous with comforting, rich French culinary tradition. When the Great Depression left families with little money to buy fuel, many turned to an age-old practice, making charcoal. By slowly burning wood scraps in a low-oxygen environment, they could create a versatile and efficient source of heat. This was an ingenious way to stretch limited resources. Wood scraps, which might have otherwise gone to waste, were transformed into charcoal that could heat homes and cook meals. In a time when every penny counted, this dual-purpose fuel was a game-changer. The process wasn't simple, though. It often required digging a small pit or using a metal container to carefully control the burning. Too much oxygen, and the wood would burn to ash. Too little, and it wouldn't transform properly. Yet families who mastered this art ensured they had a steady supply of heat, even during the coldest nights. For rural communities surrounded by forests, this practice was especially common, blending human ingenuity with nature's resources. The communal aspect of this method can't be overlooked. Neighbors often shared tips and even batches of charcoal, proving once again that survival wasn't just an individual effort, it was a team sport. Mock banana pudding was the sort of dish that showed just how inventive Depression-era cooks could be when real ingredients were simply out of reach. Bananas, once imported luxuries, quickly became too expensive for families to buy. To make up for it, people leaned on banana extract, which could be purchased cheaply and used sparingly to add flavor, layered with homemade custard, when eggs and milk could be spared, and stacked between vanilla wafers or leftover bits of stale cake. The pudding felt surprisingly close to the original. Families would chill it in an icebox if they had one, though often it was served warm right from the stove. For children, it was a rare treat that offered the illusion of a fruit dessert, even if no fresh fruit was present. In many homes, mock banana pudding became a stand-in for celebration desserts, stretching scarce supplies into something families could still enjoy together, and for many, it carried the sweetness of hope itself. Black hawthorn berries weren't really well known. They were a useful wild fruit, sure, but that was just in limited places in the Northwest and Northern Rockies. Besides just not growing in too many areas, and thus always staying in the background, black hawthorn berries started to become a reliable source of easy food during droughts. What was even rarer than the knowledge that they existed was the knowledge of how to cook them. Black hawthorn berries were something that you could make jelly and jam out of. Most people would boil them down until the natural pectin was released. Then, they'd mix them with fruits that were significantly sweeter, such as apples, Saskatoon berries, and chokecherries. Some others also used black hawthorn berries for cooking sweet sauces. They would strain the pulp out, though. It's a universally hated experience. They can be used for medicinal tea, and hawthorn berries were something that most Depression-era families can look back on very vividly. Another activity that people found pretty fun and convenient as a way of getting around the prices of gas was riding the rails. What this refers to is getting on freight trains and using those to travel, and it became a popular method of transport for homeless people who would live in Hoovervilles, or otherwise known as shanty towns. It was either this or walking incredibly long hours for an interview you may or may not get hired at, and people had only so much time and even less will. Everything felt like a battle of attrition, you know? And in times like that, it is important to get a break wherever you can. Riding rails wherever you would like to, feeling the wind on your face and hair, and knowing you were saving either a lot of cardio or a fair bit of cash felt about as close to a break as people could get in the 30s. These were not just middle-aged adults, but also young men and women in their 20s, and often even teenagers who had left home in search of work. It was common for kids to do that as their families simply could not afford to keep them, and had to focus on either the younger kids or the elderly. They fed whole families on what we'd throw away without thinking. If one of these was on your table, say which one below.